As the whole world is now painfully aware, recently another horrible tragedy has occurred, this time in Mumbai, India. So first off, and in the strongest possible language, we want to absolutely condemn these horrible and very callous crimes, which are really against all of humanity. There's no place for this type of terror, murder, under any circumstances, and especially not under the banner of Islam. So Islam clearly forbids acts of violence and terrorism, and the Holy Quran is very clear in stating that wars or any type of fighting is only allowed in defense, to uphold freedom or to stop some kind of aggressor. So if you carefully study the history of Islam, you'll find that the Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, never instigated any conflict, and in many cases even tolerated repeated injustices and injuries before ever defending himself in the faith of Islam. So, history really stands witness to this fact. For 13 years, the Muslims endured persecution, boycotts, murder, torture, robbery, some of the most heinous things you can do to a human being. They basically were the victims of it all. Their only response was to eventually flee from Mecca and leave their homes in search of a place where they could live and practice their faith in some kind of peace. So in 13 years of non-violent response, and after having had to become refugees, start their lives over essentially, the enemies of Islam still traveled hundreds of miles to exterminate them, with a well-equipped army that even I think the minimum estimates that I've heard outnumbered these poor, impoverished Muslims 4 to 1. It was only at that point when the revelation came of permission to defend themselves. So the question is, in what possible way could this history and this example of piety and patience and faith be compared to the fanatic and insane actions of these modern terrorists? These terrorists in no possible way resemble the Holy Prophet Muhammad and his faithful followers. Actually, the opposite. They're not relying upon Allah, but instead taking matters into their own bloody hands. They haven't employed forbearance and patience and all the other possible means, and they've essentially become desperate and delusional and are lashing out with no type of understanding or true faith. Actually, when you really consider it, these types of suicidal acts are really a cop-out, not an act of faith. What takes true strength and character, according to the teachings of Islam and the Holy Prophet Muhammad, is the forbearance and struggle in the face of adversity and trial, trusting in God alone, not to randomly kill and essentially commit suicide in the end. That's not courage, that's ignorance and cowardice. The Holy Quran and the example of the Prophet is very clear, in outlining the parameters of fighting. Some of those rules, there's no aggression allowed against non-aggressors, no places of worship or non-combatants should be harmed, no force is allowed in any way in matters of faith. That means that there's absolute freedom of conscience in Islam, even though that's misrepresented by some so-called Muslims and non-Muslims alike. That is the truth of the matter. The Quran even states that if you're fighting, you have to stop if the aggressor stops and asks for peace. So, when you add all of this to the other prohibitions and the rights given to, even prisoners and especially non-Muslims, Islam outdid the Geneva Convention in the United Nations over 1,400 years ago. So with this in mind, these fanatic terrorists and political groups who commit these types of acts are in no way following Islamic teachings in the Quran, and it's become quite predictable, actually. Just like with, self-proclaimed Christian abortion doctor assassins and clinic bombers, these terrorist groups only cherry-pick religious concepts and verses out of context, to justify their agendas.